Good morning and welcome back. Here we are to the next installment of Step by Step to the Coming King. We've been thinking a lot about kings recently, from Saul to David and today now to Solomon. And yesterday we saw that Solomon was a wise son of David, a wise son. And through the power of God, the promises of God, the design and will of God, in fact, Solomon became the greatest king of his day, and he became the wisest man in the world. Just read the Proverbs sometime, and that will tell you a little bit about how wise he was. But if yesterday we thought about David's wise son, Solomon, today we're thinking about David's foolish son. We're talking about the same man. And this is where the Bible is so realistic. You know, until very recently in human history, certainly if you go back to the ancient world, there was no real honest writings about, certainly not about kings and about leaders, well, not about anybody. There was no such thing as autobiography. There was no real honesty and reality in the treatment of the human condition. You can go back to the Greeks and the Romans. You can go back to the Persians and the Babylonians. When they were talking about their rulers, they really were kind of one-dimensional supermen. And this is part of the act, really. They are not vulnerable. They have no weaknesses. They win every battle. I think it had to be like that, in a sense, for people to have the confidence in their leaders. And certainly that's what they wanted to project. There's a lot of that still around in the world today. But then at a certain point, things began to change. And now today, there's so much self-reflection and so much more honesty and reality, even amongst great figures who come to write their memoirs. Yes, sometimes it's just a whitewash. Sometimes they want to portray themselves as, almost perfect. But many will confess their faults, their failings. The Bible, as an ancient book, and we're talking now about, we're going to read a passage, 1 Corinthians 11, which is nearly 3,000 years old. The Bible is absolutely unique in this sense, in every sense, but especially in this sense, that its heroes are portrayed in such a full way, such a realistic way, such an honest way. We see their flaws as well as their genius. We see their achievements, but we also see their failings. And as we get towards the end of the Old Testament, particularly this section we're looking at this week, remember the overall title of this week is God's People Divide. And that comes from within. The divisions within us then are projected onto others and onto the world. And that is the source of all of our problems. And we know where that all comes from originally, because we've read the early chapters of Genesis, the way in which Adam and Eve did not listen to God. They did not obey his commands at a certain point anyway. They listened rather to the serpent, to Satan. They believed the lie rather than the truth. They didn't believe that when they ate of the fruit of the tree in the garden that they would die. They didn't believe that. They didn't take that seriously. So they disobeyed God, thinking that was a small thing, thinking that was, just a little thing, that they should listen to this serpent, that he should be a source of truth and reality and wisdom for them as well. Whereas they didn't understand, they didn't have the discernment to realize that this serpent is the devil. He's a liar. He's a murderer. He's only out to destroy God if he could, and he can't do that. So the next best thing he will destroy his image. And what is his image? Or rather, who is his image? Well, you're looking at him. Every time you look in the mirror, you've been made in the image of God. And so Satan wants to do everything he can to destroy you. That's ultimately why the Lord Jesus Christ had to come into the world. We are not strong enough to conquer Satan, who was this mighty, created angelic being, a fallen angel, who had all this power, particularly the power of deception. Remember, in the Garden of Eden, did God say, "You will not surely die"? Well, God did say, and they will die, and they do die eventually. Not straight away. That's the mercy of God, that they weren't struck down the very moment that they ate the fruit, the forbidden fruit, but they are expelled from the garden, though they are covered by those coverings provided through a sacrifice. And that is the gospel, and that's the way forward. Well, from a position of being the wisest people in the universe, there were only two of them, Adam and Eve, they became utter fools. From being the wisest king in the world, Solomon, we'll see how he becomes such a fool now. And that is still the way of the world today. People who think they're brilliant, and they are, in a worldly sense, in an intellectual sense. They have their education, they have their expertise in the realms of science or academia or practical skills. They can build fantastic buildings. They can make millions on the stock market and so on. All these abilities and skills come from God. He's given us these things. But people reject the knowledge and the grace and the wisdom that comes from God. They say there is no God. The fool has said in his heart there is no God. And the result of that is that the wise, they think themselves wise, but they are fools. And their understanding is darkened, and they end up worshipping created things rather than the Creator. That is the ultimate folly, the folly of idolatry. Well, let's read it in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 to 13. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you've not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." Amen. Well, again, rather sobering after the wonderful revelations that Solomon enjoyed yesterday, the Lord appearing to him. This is referred to in this passage, verse 9. The Lord became became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. After those two great revelations which set him up, which gifted him by God's power and grace to be this mighty king, King Solomon, the wisest man in the world. How are the mighty fallen, we might say. And this is the turning point here. Solomon made such a good start, but as time went by, he began to compromise. What was Solomon's great weakness? Verse 1, he loved many foreign women. And verse 3, he had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. Now that might seem astonishing to you. You might think that is unbelievable, but I can assure you that in the ancient world, these kinds of harems were not unusual. Seems a lot, doesn't it? A lot of women for wives and concubines. But no, I mean, it's extreme. And but the point is, everybody was doing this. The harem is not a biblical idea. Yes, there are times in the history of God's people when the Lord seemed to allow his people to practice polygamy, many wives. David had many wives, and so on. But not 700. 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. I mean, this is now going to such an extreme that's the point. And it's what the world was doing. It's exactly what the pagans were up to. And this is his great weakness now, because it's not just sex. I mean, I think it's almost physically impossible to have sex with that number of people. But the point is, verse 3, not so much what it did to his body, but of what it was doing to his mind and his heart. And his wives led him astray. Why was that? Well, he loved them, but that's not the main point. You see, God had commanded Solomon a number of things, but let's just remind ourselves what he had said. These women, they were from the nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, verse 2, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. You shall not intermarry with the pagans, with the nations, because, well, you'll fall in love with them, and through them, you'll fall in love with their gods. And if you fall in love with another woman, you'll fall out of love almost certainly with the first woman, or the first few, or the first few hundred, or whatever is going on. You just can't sustain this. You can't be in love with all of them. So you'll suddenly transfer your affections to other women, and then you'll transfer your affections from the true and living God to these other gods. Partly to please them, but partly because your heart, your affections, they are being drawn into this whole world, this other interpretation of reality, where you have many gods which you make, they're products of your imagination, little idols set up on a hill. You go there, you make offerings, you bow down to things that you have created. And then verses 9 and 10, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who'd appeared to him twice. He'd had personal appearances from Yahweh, Jehovah God, the creator, the God of Israel, the judge of all the earth, had met with him, had spoken to him, had changed him, had blessed him, had given him all this tremendous wisdom. Israel was never more powerful and was never a greater influence in the world than at this point in their history. In the previous chapter, the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon. They were coming to him from the ends of the earth. We have examples in the stories of his wonderful wisdom. And it's all from God. Verse 10, although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So when it comes down to it, this is the Garden of Eden again. God had spoken, and for a while there was obedience, but then Satan comes. He comes now through these pagan women. He comes now, Satan works his way into our hearts. Through affection, through relationships. This is why Christians should never have intimate relationships with non-Christians, certainly never marry them. It's not because they're wicked and evil people, but it's because their value system is fundamentally different. And so many believers, and I'm not saying that they're not true believers, have then been sucked into that world. And you can't do both. You can't straddle both. And you've given your heart and your body to someone who's not a Christian, and how easy it would be to give your heart, your soul, your spirit, your mind to that system, the world system which they're in, which they're part of, which they follow because they're children of the devil. How can a child of God, a child of light, be joined with a child of darkness? The dangers are tremendous, and God says, don't do it. Don't intermarry. Because so many people have been led astray in this way. They stop coming to church. They stop reading their Bibles. Maybe there's still a flame, a little spark within them. Maybe, who knows? Only God knows ultimately the state of everybody's heart. But it's one of the key ways in which Satan will work now. In the Garden of Eden, he popped up as a serpent. He doesn't do that anymore. That's so obvious. Now his ways are much more subtle, and he deals with and he works through these most basic realities: human love, relationships, affection, intimacy, marriage. Of course, he will use that to infiltrate and to subvert the hearts of God's people. He did it with a mighty man like Solomon, wiser than any of us, and yet he is captivated and brought low by this satanic deception. Solomon disobeyed, just like Adam and Eve in the garden. He broke his agreement with God. What was going to be the result? Verse 11, so the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you've not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Exactly like God had done in the Garden of Eden, that wonderful garden. It was torn away from them and they were exiled. Exactly the same thing's going to happen now to Solomon, but on a much vaster scale. The wonderful kingdom of Israel will be torn in two, and they will be exiled. Just like Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, Solomon's descendants will be kicked out of the land. We're getting there in the storyline of Old Testament Israel. Now, there is a caveat to this, verse 12, nevertheless, because of David's faithfulness, actually, that will be a mercy. That will bring mercy upon Solomon. And actually, even Adam and Eve in the garden, there's mercy there. Yes, there's a solemn, serious judgment, mostly on the serpent, but also on the human beings and on the planet. But God said, in the day that you eat of it, you'll die. Well, they did die spiritually, but God didn't smite them. He didn't kill them on the spot. Because what does he go on to do? He goes on to make coverings for them. He goes on to provide for their nakedness, and he gives them promises. And even in the severity of his judgments, God is merciful. Verse 12, nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. For the sake of David, earlier on, he says a remarkable thing about David. He says about Solomon, his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. Again, you think, well, are you talking about the same David, the one who committed adultery with Bathsheba and was responsible for killing her husband and many other, weaknesses and wobbles in the life of David? Yeah, we're talking about the same King David, because as God thinks about this man and as he reflects on his life, he sees only the good. He sees only the faithfulness and the wholeheartedness of David. That was the trajectory of his life. That's basically the kind of man that he was, a man after my own heart. He made mistakes. He failed. He fell. He got it wrong many times. Once spectacularly. Of course he did. But he didn't marry 700 royal wives and 300. He didn't have 300 concubines. He didn't go to the extreme folly now of his son. And because of his greatness and great example and great faithfulness, which is generally how we should think of King David. That's, I think, why he has this exalted position in the Bible, and why the Lord Jesus Christ, he's not called a son of Solomon, is he? In the New Testament, he's called a son of David. And that's significant. Solomon crashes lower than any other up to this point. This is like Eden and the fall all over again. And the promised land is like the Garden of Eden, and it's going to be destroyed. And God's people are going to be exiled. They're going to be kicked out. And it's all because of the idolatry and the unfaithfulness of this man, this great man. But because of David's faithfulness, what does the Lord say? I'm going to do this, but not in your lifetime. And I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem. So it's not going to be total destruction. There is the possibility of a way back. There is a glimmer of hope. There is a promise there, and which, of course there is. And the Israelites who will be kicked out of the land, they will come back, or some of them will. Because ultimately, where is all of this going? It's step by step to the coming king. So it's going to get bad, very bad. It's going to get a lot worse. But constantly we need to be thinking, this is not the end. This is not the end. This is not the end. There's hope. There's a way back. And when we look at the state of the world, even when the world comes to an end, that will not be the end for true believers. There's always hope. And it's bound up with the Lord's return, of course. The coming king, he came once, he's coming again. That's our hope, which we need to cling to. Just a thought as we close. The question is put here in my notes here. How can the faithfulness of Christian parents help their children? The thought is here, isn't it? David's faithfulness will somewhat soften the blow of God's judgment on Solomon's unfaithfulness. And dear Christian parents, just keep faithful. There will come a point in your life where you can't control your children anymore. You could when they were babies and toddlers and younger ones. You could control and direct and instruct and so on. But there'll come a point where you can't do that anymore. They won't allow you to. And maybe, like David with Solomon, maybe they'll just go off on a wild tangent. But will your faithful example and teaching and prayers have a modifying effect, a sanctifying effect on your children? The principle is here. And be faithful and see what God will do. God bless you, and look forward to seeing you again this time tomorrow. Take care.